So Richard Allen is the founder of Mother Bethel, the church here in Philadelphia, but even more, he was instrumental in founding the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He was born a slave. He was wakened, that is, became a Christian while still a slave, came to Philadelphia, and then recruited many other slaves, or freed slaves, who were flooding into the city. And out of that came first Mother Bethel and then the AME Church. The Methodists and the Baptists during the First and Second Great Awakening were exhibiting a great deal of racial equality relative to other churches, except the Quakers. The Quakers were also welcoming blacks. But it was in transition. So what starts out with a great deal of equality is beginning to come under pressure by the end of the 18th century and into the early 19th century. With all of the talk about freedom and all of the revolutionary talk in the late 18th century, there was a loosening of laws. Abolition begins to spread throughout the northern states, and even in some of the border states, the rules around manumission of slaves are relaxed. The laws are relaxed. But there's a pushback that begins to grow as a result of that. In addition to that, as more and more blacks are either just walking away from the plantations or farms on which they serve in the northern states, or are experiencing manumission, or are coming to the end of their terms in terms of gradual abolition, the number of blacks, free blacks, is growing. And so, for example, in St. George's, where Richard Allen is preaching, he's not preaching in the church, but he is using that as a base for his preaching to newly freed slaves. The rising number of blacks creates discomfort and a growing desire for segregation within the church. So these newly freed slaves, many of whom are coming from Pennsylvania, out in rural areas because of the gradual abolition that's been implemented in Pennsylvania, but also some who are coming from being manumitted from in the border states, are flooding into the city. And Richard Allen visits the city of Philadelphia intending to stay only for a couple of weeks, but he finds that these newly freed slaves are not being ministered to by the Methodists. Increasingly, there is a lack of concern for the well-being of these black people, and Allen gets permission from St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church to actually preach. And he goes out, evangelizes, tells these people about the gospel, brings them into St. George's. So they are, for the most part, poor, looking for work, and straight out of slavery. So there are a couple of things that Allen thought were really important about Methodism in terms of reaching out to these newly freed people. He saw these as simple doctrines appropriate for simple people, so that these were doctrines that were easily understood. And in addition to that, these were not, the style of Methodist preaching was not very scholarly and read from a sermon. Rather, it was extemporaneous. People spoke from the heart. And this, he felt, was very powerful and, in fact, proved very effective in reaching out to newly freed slaves. Allen himself was no doubt a brilliant man and very charismatic as well. Initially, they come into St. George's, and they start out just being seated with everyone else in the church. Eventually, as I said, this growing discomfort of the white congregation, they're pushed to sit on the edges. And however, St. George's, the congregation is expanding, and so the building is refurbished and a gallery is constructed. And now there's supposed to be segregated seating. And the black people are being pushed to sit in this segregated seating in the gallery. So Allen and the other African Americans arrive at the church one morning in 1792 to be told that they should sit in the gallery. Now, there seems to be some debate about whether they go to the gallery and are told to move to the back, or whether they take their seats along the side where they have previously been seated, but they don't sit in the assigned place. And they're on their knees in prayer. Absalom Jones, in particular, is among them, and deacons, white deacons, approach and tell them that they must move into the appropriate seating. And Jones says, we will, once we've finished prayer. And they proceed to physically lift him from his knees to put him in the appropriate seat. By that point, however, prayer is over, and Allen leads all of the African Americans out of the church, to which they never return. The elders of St. George and the members of St. George are initially outraged and attempt to actually excommunicate the blacks who leave. However, as Allen successfully argues, they had not broken any form of Methodist discipline, and so they were not able to be successful. In a struggle that then lasts approximately 20 years, the elders of St. George's continue to attempt to control what becomes Mother Bethel. So Allen had thought for a while that there needed to be an African church, because he recognized the growing hostility towards them and the lack of concern for their well-being. But that was not well received. He had founded, along with Absalom Jones, the Free African Society, which was a mutual aid society, the first one in the United States, and which Allen saw as perhaps a precursor to an African church. But it was an interdenominational group, and not everyone agreed with him and wanted to adopt Methodism, to which he remained really deeply committed. So some scholars have thought that perhaps he precipitated that confrontation in St. George's because there was this hesitancy on the part of blacks to actually found an African church. What happens, the fact that he waits until they are confronted in the manner in which they were, it both solidifies black determination to leave the church, and that's why he's able to lead everyone out in a body, but it also wins them sympathy. It wins them white supporters, and later on this will be important as they found the church. Benjamin Rush in particular is one of those supporters, and they actually help pay for the building as they start a new church. And so there is this goodwill that results because other whites can see that they were ill-treated, and this goodwill sustains them in raising the funds that they need to build the church. Mother Bethel is actually incorporated in 1796. It is a white trustee from St. George's who writes the Constitution, and it's written in such a way as to give St. George's control over Mother Bethel. Now, the members of Mother Bethel don't discover this for a decade. At that point, when they do discover it, they consult lawyers, and they realize that they can by voting actually supersede that original constitution. They do that, and in 1807 they write the African Supplement, which gives them control over the church. However, the elders in St. George's continue to believe that that African Supplement does not hold water. And they stir up trouble in a lot of ways, not just in challenging the African Supplement, which gave Mother Bethel control of itself, but they refuse. Allen was not ordained as a deacon at the time of leaving St. George's, so they had to look to the elders of St. George's to administer communion and the sacraments. So St. George's tried to use that as a means of controlling Mother Bethel. In addition to that, once they challenged the African Supplement, and actually in 1814, they put Mother Bethel up for auction. Allen, who was a very very wise with money, had been accumulating funds for the church and for himself privately, and was able to buy back his own church building when St. George's had this put up for auction. So for the price of $10,000, over $10,000 at the time, which now is somewhere around $190,000 in 2022, he is able to buy back the building and secure it despite of all that St. George's does. But that's not enough. The elders actually are also insisting that they have the right to preach whenever the elders from St. George's are arguing they have the right to preach whenever they wish to at Mother Bethel. Allen is actually ordained by Francis Asbury, who is a prominent bishop in the Methodist Church, in 1799. So after Mother Bethel is founded, he is ordained. But despite this, these elders are insisting that they have the right to preach at any point that they want to. And the members of the church rise up against them. In particular, in 1814, the elder from St. George's comes and announces that he's going to preach, and they block all of the aisles with furniture and with their bodies. He attempts to speak from the back of the church. They shout him down. And it was not Allen at the church, strategically. They knew when he was coming. And instead, the preacher just keeps on preaching and just completely ignores him. So that the resistance to St. George's is not just Allen. It is these freed slaves who are making a stand for their independence and for their rights, their religious freedom, their right to worship as they see appropriate. What happens next is that the elder from St. George's, Robert Birch, files a suit for mandamus that the church would be ordered to allow him to preach. And that suit goes all the way to the Supreme Court, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And they find for Richard Allen and Mother Bethel in 1816. And at that point, Mother Bethel is completely free from control of St. George's. And it's a huge victory for Allen. Richard Allen was a huge proponent of abolition and spoke frequently against slavery. And he does so speaking at his church. So there is a eulogy of George Washington, which he preaches at his church, in which he is praising Washington for freeing his slaves in his will, that they would be set free on the death of his wife. And Allen uses that as an opportunity to encourage other slaveholders to follow the example of Washington. He also uses it as an opportunity to warn them that God is not for slavery, pointing, as many African American preachers would, as the African Americans of the period did regularly, to the Exodus, that God brought judgment on the holders of slaves in destroying the Egyptian Pharaoh. And he says that slaveholders who fail to follow Washington's example should beware the wrath of God. Not only does he preach this in his church, but he also has it published. It's published first in the Philadelphia Gazette, and then it's published again in New York. And this is just one of many times when he will speak out against slavery. The first copyrighted publication by African Americans is a pamphlet written by Allen and Absalom Jones, where they are defending the black Philadelphians who are accused of having behaved poorly during a yellow fever epidemic. But Allen takes that opportunity to append to it a statement against slavery, where he calls out again those who would hold slaves, and again pointing to the religious reasons, the biblical reasons why slavery is wrong. He also writes a eulogy for an abolitionist, Warner Mifflin, pointing to all that he has done in very warm terms, because both he and Mifflin were Methodists and were supporters of each other, and he writes in very warm terms about the importance of ending of Mifflin's role in protesting slavery, in setting free his own slaves, in working for abolition. So Allen is very strongly, both in preaching in his church and in his pamphlets, speaking out against slavery. Some scholars have said that Richard Allen has a kind of precursor to liberation theology, that his theology saw God as the champion of the poor, the oppressed, and the disadvantaged. And that is evident in his concern for these freed slaves. It's evident in the terms in which he talks about God and the Exodus, God's judgment on slaveholders. He sees God as being on the side of the poor and the weak. It is this theology that is not allowed to take full expression in St. George's. So this really is an issue of religious freedom that he is lobbying for. He is acting in concert with his deeply held religious beliefs, and he's acting for the freedom to pursue his understanding of the gospel. There is this determination to follow through on an understanding of the gospel that comes from a reading of the Bible that really revolves around Exodus, and the determination to live out that faith, and to do it in a way that honors another really important aspect of Christianity in the Black church from the days of slavery, which is the idea that all human beings are equal before God. All men and women are equal before God. The Methodists had started there. They had started there with this very egalitarian approach in their evangelism and in opposition to having slaveholders in the church. By the time the African Methodist Episcopal Church is founded, the Methodist Church now allows slaveholders to be members of the church, and the only thing that was grounds for excommunication was slave trading. They are violating their own understanding. The Methodists at this point are violating their own understanding of equality before God, that all people are equal before God. But it is this religious foundation, it is this understanding of religion that is driving African Americans to leave Methodism and to found the AME Church. I think it's really important to recognize that there's an issue of religious freedom here. Richard Allen becomes a Christian, comes out of slavery in an era when increasing numbers of blacks are being freed. And he has this idea which has been called racial vindication, that one of the concerns that Benjamin Franklin, who is a late comer to abolition, but late in life he becomes the president of the Philadelphia Abolitionist Society, but he's concerned that as blacks are freed, they are going to be, they're not ready for freedom. They need the Philadelphia Abolitionist Society to function as like moral guardians, to watch over them. It's a kind of paternalistic position. And Allen pushes back against that and says, look, treat them as your family. What would you do for your own family in this situation? He recognizes that it's really poverty and hardship, all of the difficulties that these freed slaves that are facing that are the challenge. It's not their moral character. He says what we need to do is teach freed slaves the principles of Christianity, the principles of good citizenship, and you will see that they will in fact be good, virtuous people. The idea that black people could win over the white slaveholders by demonstrating their humanity, by demonstrating their ability to be good citizens. And this is something that Allen actually becomes somewhat disappointed, perhaps disillusioned with. So that he moves from this idea that America can be redeemed, that it can embrace blacks as full equals, because he was always arguing not just for the abolition of slavery, but for full racial equality. He begins to think over time that that is not going to happen. He sees the kind of disparagement of African American behavior following the yellow fever epidemic, where people who selflessly and bravely ministered to the sick, removed dead bodies, in many cases not being compensated, now being accused of price gouging. He begins to see that as a pattern. Following the War of 1812, there's all of this resentment against African Americans that's growing. Slavery is spreading in the South. There's a kind of backlash against the liberalization that came immediately following the Revolution. And Allen begins to lose faith and supports colonization, supports the idea that black people need to leave the United States in order to reach full equality. He first supports colonization in Africa, but he and other leaders, black leaders in Philadelphia, are chastened by common Philadelphians. There's a big meeting at Mother Bethel in 1817 where they are told that common Philadelphians, Afro-Philadelphians, are not on board with the idea of colonization. And so James Forten, Richard Allen, and other leaders change their position on their support for the Colonization Society. Oh gosh, can't think of the right name. They change their position on colonization to Africa, but Allen continues to support colonization, first to Haiti, then to the Caribbean, and finally to Canada. So this idea that black people can justify themselves and can convince white people of their humanity and of their worth he begins to lose faith in it. And in fact, perhaps it's flawed from the outset, that he doesn't recognize that the roots of slavery are not in any lack of humanity on black people's part or our need to demonstrate it, but really are in flaws in the enslavers. And he doesn't confront that initially. From the first Great Awakening, because prior to that, slaves were resistant to Christianity. But from the first Great Awakening, when two things happen. One, there is, as I said before, this important focus on racial justice. But there's also a difference in style, that the gospel is being presented in a much more emotional, much more ecstatic form, which Africans responded to. That was a familiar style of worship to them. From that point on, Christianity plays such an important role in the black community. And it is really on display in the civil rights movement. The gains of the civil rights movement are really a massive expression of a people acting on their deeply held religious convictions, a massive expression of religious freedom. Martin Luther King Jr. Scholars debate to what extent he holds with the ideas of Reinhold Niebuhr, but all agree that he's deeply impacted by them. And Niebuhr's position, so he has, there are a couple of trends there. The social gospel, the kind of Niebuhrian realism, and the personalism are all affecting his thinking. And the social gospel of Rauschenbusch, he begins to see that as being the idea that you should use Christianity as a tool to change and challenge social problems. But it's very optimistic. It has this idea of perfectibility, that humans can be perfected, that you could actually that we're on a trajectory towards perfection. And that kind of liberalism King moves away from because he's been raised in the South. He's seen the stubbornness of racism. He's seen the ugliness of white supremacy. And he is not able to accept that kind of very optimistic position. And so he's drawn to Niebuhr's more realistic position that evil is real and powerful, that it's present in the institutions of society, and that it will not yield without a fight. And that in fact what is needed is a kind of coercive nonviolence. King adopts and grows into this position, especially as he gets involved with the civil rights movement. But it is these deep convictions that leads him, and also some of the coincidences of history. So when he arrives in Montgomery, Alabama, to take up his first pastorate, he's a new kid on the block. And these issues around the Montgomery bus boycott are just getting started. And E.D. Nixon, who was a very important organizer in Montgomery, recognizes that there are already factions around different churches, but King is a newcomer, and so he is drafted into leadership. But it's really based on these religious convictions that he is able to take on the leadership, and in the course of a year, he is able to lead this boycott that lasts a year, and which in the end leads to the integration of the busing in Montgomery. King recognizes that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is founded the following year, he's not the only one involved in this. It's really important to recognize the role that Bayard Rustin plays and others in founding the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But King is the one who says, this can't just be the Southern Leadership Conference. We are a deeply religious people. It has to be the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He recognizes the extent to which it's really the commitment to Christianity that motivates Black Southerners in their struggle for racial justice. It is this belief that we talked about with Alan, that all men and women are equal before God. It is this belief that the Exodus is the motif of Christianity. It actually comes back to us in James Cone in his liberation theology, where Cone says any Christian who doesn't recognize that liberation is the thrust, not just in Exodus, but even in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It is liberation, which is at the heart of the gospel, is no Christian at all. That if you don't recognize that, you're not a genuine Christian. And if you're a genuine Christian, then you have to be working on these issues of liberation, not just in the life to come, but here on earth. This is what's motivating the Southern Civil Rights Movement. So it's really an outpouring of religious freedom because people are standing up for what they truly believe. King is not the only one who sees it this way. Fred Shuttlesworth in Birmingham, Alabama, argues that this really is a religious event. This is a religious movement, and that we are moving on doing what God has called us to do. According to Fannie Lou Hamer, if God wants to start a movement, who am I to argue with him? And she's speaking to the students of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who were, many of them were either ministers themselves or in ministerial studies, but a lot of them were not. Some were white, some were Jewish, some were no faith at all. And she's saying, look, when you come to the South and you work with these people, you have to understand that you are God's answer to our prayers. You have to understand how deeply held these religious beliefs are. It's really clear that all of this is an expression of religious commitment. That it is that give people the courage to go into the streets, face down Bull Connor with police dogs and water hoses. In fact, what would happen is there would be services the night before in churches where there would be rousing preaching, there would be ecstatic singing, all of which this outpouring of the Spirit empowered people to have the courage not just to face down these dogs and hoses and police with batons, but to do it without retaliating. To do it without retaliating, which has important implications. Because to descend into violence, they would have been overcome. They wouldn't have had a chance against the kind of force that was arrayed against them had they descended into violence. But in addition to that, it wins the sympathy of people who are watching on TV all over the country, around the world, in fact. It wins the goodwill, which causes the federal government to have to send in forces. And so the victory is won because of the religious understanding and commitment that motivates them. The civil rights movement is much more than those famous figures. Fannie Lou Hamer is held up as the epitome of the rank and file, and she was that. She was a poor sharecropper, but truly an outstanding woman in every other way. But the people whose names we never learn were acting on their religious freedom, their deeply held religious beliefs, in their equality before God, in their dignity before God, just as much as any of the leaders were. Black churches continue to act on deeply held religious beliefs. And I'll tell you about a couple of studies that show that. Ram Kannan, who is a scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, did a study of congregations in the city of Philadelphia. And he found that black congregations were smaller, poorer than other congregations in the city, but that they provided over $90 million annually in services to the community around them. And this study was done in the early 2000s, so it would be worth even more now. And they were operating, caring for people in their neighborhoods. They were more likely than other congregations to provide support to poor people, to drug users, basically to the neediest people in the city. And to some extent that was because of the location of those churches, but it's also coming from their religious belief. They found that these churches were very likely to be involved in providing services for youth, in providing food pantries, and that it was disproportionate given the size and resources of the congregations. A second study found that 70 to 90% of black churches were involved in providing similar services to what were found here in Philadelphia. Food pantries, clothing for the homeless, cash assistance to needy people. And this study also found that in cases where there was a relationship between the number of what were called priestly actions, so Bible studies and other services offered by the church, the number of these services were related to the proportion of service provided to the community, indicating the connection between religious conviction and providing these services. So the black church continues to exercise their religious freedom, not just for the good of in their own congregations, but the neighborhoods in which they're located, much as Richard Allen and the church did during the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia back in the 18th century. And we live right now in a time of such political impasse, it is hard to see how one would readily get the government to replace services which just among black congregations were worth over $90 million annually. It's important to recognize that free exercise is still important today. However, there is, I think, waning support in the United States for religion. There's waning interest. Repeated studies have shown that each generation there are fewer people, there's a growing proportion of nones, people who are unaffiliated with any kind of faith. But that's not the only problem that we as a church are facing. We're also facing declining sympathy and tolerance, or recognition of the importance of religion. That I think increasingly the church is seen as exclusionary and as prejudiced, as intolerant. And I think that this is a really important shift that's happening, and that it's important for us to make to make it clear that not only has religion been historically important, but that it continues to be important today. That it's important not only in providing for the neediest, but also it's important because each and every person has a right to follow through on his or her conscience, to act in accordance with conscience, and to do that not just in the closet in prayer, not just in worship in your church, but to do that in the public square, that every person has a right to act on that. African Americans continue to be the most devout demographic in the country. And the share of nuns is lowest among African Americans. In addition to that, studies have found, the Pew Research Center has found repeatedly, that African Americans who are unaffiliated still have very high levels of belief. High levels of belief in the existence of God. Many of them still pray, still read their Bible. So I don't think we should assume that because people are unaffiliated, they aren't people of faith. To what extent am I free to be a Christian and to say that I am a Christian? That's a place where free exercise, I think, it's in these small things where I think free exercise is perhaps most under threat today. It's also under threat in other areas. There are college student groups which have been decertified by their colleges because of their requirement to have people who share their beliefs lead these groups. Now that has gone to the Supreme Court, and the case they won. And the colleges had to reinstate the groups. But it's really important for us to think about the ways in which college campuses are a place where free exercise might not be as free as we think it is. And there are other places where in churches, in the Black church, to what extent are we able to provide the services that we do provide if we take positions which are politically unpopular, which are now seen as prejudicial, which are now seen as discriminatory? Will we lose the right to provide services? Is free exercise under threat there?